Well, here we are again, back with one of my favorite friends and one of my favorite colleagues, and a guy who is just kind of moving faster than anybody else, can't keep up with him because he's always coming up with brand new material, has a whole team around him that's helping him out. And he is going so fast that there's sometimes he has to put on the brakes and he has to reassess what he has said before and say, hold on a minute. We may have gone too fast on a certain subject. We need to go and look and see, hold on, there's some new materials coming to fore that actually makes that obsolete, and we need to go with what that new material is. Now remember, what have we always said? Mel and I and the others who have been putting together these different programs, these different episodes on the history of the origins of Islam, we've always said, always go back to the 7th century. Read the 7th century, get back into it, find out as much material from that century, the century when Islam supposedly was put together, and just assess what you're reading, assess what you're looking at, whether it's coins or whether it's rock inscriptions or whether it's buildings or whether it's the Qibla of the buildings, whether it's documents like the protocols or manuscripts or anything else that comes to hand there in the 7th century or even early 6th and 5th and 4th. But don't go to the 9th and 10th century. Stay away from the 9th and 10th century because it's too late. It's all that is redacted. That's redactions. That's just allegations. They're alleging. I'm sorry, let me get my pronunciation. They're just alleging what they think happened way up there in Iraq is where they're putting this all together, talking about what's happening hundreds of miles away down in Mecca and Medina in a city that didn't even exist. So that's why Mel has done this. He's gone back and he wants to look at the name Umar. Today, we're going to look at the person Umar. Who is this character? Now, in previous videos, we have said there is no Umar. Well, we didn't say there was no Umar. We just don't think, we said he is not a caliph. We don't know him as a caliph. And we don't know of anybody called Umar living down in Mecca and Medina. That's what the 9th and 10th century traditions tell us, that here is the caliph, the second of the caliphs in the what we know as the Rashidun period, the rightly guided, that section of rightly guided caliph from 624 up to 661 before Muawiyah takes over power in the Umayyad dynasty. So here is this Umar, suppose the second caliph, and he's now gone back and he says, hold on a minute, we need to reassess that Umar. We need to go back and look at that Umar again because new material is coming up, new material we're looking at. And this is material that has been written by people. You'll recognize some of the names. You're going to recognize this because we've talked about these names before, and they do refer to someone named Umar. In the past, we've just said, well, anybody can be called Umar. But hold on a minute. There are specific things said about this Umar and the fact that he is called Muhammad. But why is this Umar called Muhammad? And could this be possibly the Muhammad we're looking for in the 7th century? Now, Mel, welcome. So good to have you again.
Great to be back. Yeah.
You're still on vacation, aren't you?
I am, yeah, but when Jake...
you're supposed to be vacationing, for heaven's sake. What are you doing still working on this material when you're supposed to be on vacation?
Yeah, unfortunately, I just can't disconnect from this, even when I'm trying my damnedest to get away. And the worst thing about vacation is I'm constantly thinking about the material, and I'm beginning to make connections when I'm away from things. So, you know, a good long walk is great for making links.
And you've got such a good team behind you. Now, what you're going to do today is you're going to actually unpack what they have been sending you, what you have been looking at, the research you've been putting together. So this has already been well formulated. You put together a PowerPoint. So I'm just going to give it over to you. Help us with who this Umar is from the 7th century. The Umar that we've all thought was a man living down in Mecca, Medina, who we thought was a caliph. Help us here. Over to you. Let's go, and I'll let you introduce it.
Okay, so I'm going to just start by showing the PowerPoint here. And I start by mentioning that the Sen misdirects us to a period pre-632. So I've been looking for a character that fits Muhammad in that time frame. But unfortunately, I trusted the Sen too much. And I realized eventually, after a lot of searching, that this was a bit of a wild goose chase. And I was looking for the wrong person in the wrong place at the wrong time. So let me just... So while I tried to find a historical person that might match the Sen's general timeline and proposed Iyas ibn Qabis al-Tay, more recent evidence has led me to realize that this was another wild goose chase, and I got misled by the 9th century narrative proposed by the Sen. I suppose the moral of the lesson is don't trust the Sen too much. The Sen directs us to look for Muhammad in the 610 to 632 period, but he's not to be
Stop
found
right
there.
there, just so people know what you're talking about, because I'm just laughing away when you say there's sin this and there's sin that, and don't trust sin. We know not to trust sin. But what you're talking about is a standard Islamic narrative. For folks, if you're
Yes.
new to Mel, Mel loves to put things in acronyms, and the acronyms he puts there are usually are true, but they're also a joke that goes behind it. Standard Islamic narrative are the Islamic traditions. These are the
Yeah.
traditional traditions that are written down in the 9th and 10th century. Muslims like to call them the traditions of the Sirah, that be the biography of Muhammad, the Hadith, which would be the sayings of Muhammad, and the Tafsir al-Natari, which would be the commentaries of the Quran and the history of mankind. All of that packaged together is the standard Islamic narrative. And the reason why Mel's running with this is because Qadi, who actually talked about the standard Islamic narrative, he said the standard narratives has holes in it. He said this over a year ago. And so we're running with what Qadi, in some ways, we're taking what he said and we're just running with it. Now, it just so happens, surprise, surprise, that when you say standard Islamic narrative, it says sin. So Mel's having a great time shutting down and confronting sin, which we should do anyway, shouldn't we? Back to you, Mel.
Yeah. So essentially, I was fooled by the misdirection that's at play in this standard Islamic narrative. It basically says look for him in this time period, but of course, if you go to find him there historically, you can't find him. That was the issue. So one person that has helped me a great deal in terms of looking at Umar again has been Joe. I've had a number of discussions with Joe from Red Judaism on this matter, and his arguments won out. He was right. So about 7 or 8 months ago, he persuaded me that Umar was the real Muhammad. He didn't persuade me initially. It took a bit of thinking and a lot of arguments, and then subsequently, I found additional information that made me realize that actually Joe was right all along. So he really kind of helped a great deal in making me rethink it and dropping the ES idea. ES may have contributed something to the composite idea of Muhammad in the later tradition, but really that was a distraction. So what I'm going to look at now is some of the earliest references to Muhammad that we've got. And one of the best ones is from Thomas the Presbyter, who writes in 640 AD. And it's the earliest reference to Muhammad that we've got. And it appears to be a contemporary reference to Muhammad. So it's dated to Friday, February 634. There was a battle between the Romans and the Tayyaye of Muhammad in Palestine, 12 miles east of Gaza. So, of course, if we think about it, who was the leader between 634 and 644? Well, there are numerous late 7th century sources that tell us that Umar was the leader at that time. So he would be the obvious candidate. Well, it's obvious now, I suppose, but he would be the obvious candidate for this person who was going by the nickname Muhammad, if we can call it that, the title Muhammad. So that's
up in there real quickly.
Yeah.
Are you therefore suggesting that actually the sin narrative is correct on this? Because really the first time we hear about Umar's date, 634 to 644, is in the standard Islamic narrative. We don't get that until 833.
There are some late 7th century sources that I've seen that have various lists of who reigned at different periods. Now, there's a lot of contradiction between them, but there seems to be a fairly solid consistency, at least with the reign of Umar. The confusing ones were the reign of Muhammad, because Muhammad's reign, which was meant to happen before Abu Bakr, that never seemed to work out because obviously it was made up. So they could never quite make him stick in the period before Abu Bakr. So that made me very suspicious.
So what you seem to be telling me now, I'm hearing a completely different narrative now. You are suggesting there was an Abu Bakr.
Don't know for certain, but my main point really is that there are some of these dates that seem to be consistent, and one of the dates that seem to be consistent in the late 7th century sources that we have would be Umar. The earlier ones, there's confusion about how long they reigned and when they started the reign.
Is there any reference from the 7th century for someone named Abu Bakr?
There is, but again, we're dealing with an epithet, a title, I believe, with Abu Bakr. So who is Abu Bakr? We don't know exactly who he is.
Let me ask you another question.
He is hidden behind the title. Like the title would suggest he's the father of a tribe called the Bakr tribe, which is, I believe, in southern Iraq. That's what the name would suggest. Okay. Some people might dispute that and say, well, no, it was the Bakr tribe down in the Hijaz, but there was a Bakr tribe in Iraq. And I would suggest that maybe that's where the name came from. But what was his real name? I've no idea.
Obviously, if the people are going to say there's a Bakr down in Hijaz, they're going to have to show support for that. There's no support for anybody in the Hijaz that would name a Bakr that far south. Now, the next question. Do you believe there was an Uthman or an Ali? Ali, we're going to get to, I know, later on in this PowerPoint, but do you believe there was an Uthman?
There are references to him. I would be open to the possibility that there was. And in terms of Ali, there's two particularly good references to him, but there's a caveat with Ali. The first caveat is that the 7th century reference to Ali says that he died a couple of years earlier than the standard Islamic narrative says he died.
Was he a caliph?
It just says that he was the Amir of Hira. It doesn't say he's a caliph. So, yes.
So none of these four that we're talking about are, and we might have to do a whole nother video, you and I, on just reassessing who Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali are. We don't even know if they follow one another. We're not even sure if they're in the same area, but not one of them is from Mecca and Medina. They're all from Iraq, or what is today Syria. So it looks like they're all from the north, and they're all, what we're probably going to, I'm assuming you're going to come to a conclusion is, they are nothing more than leaders of men in those areas. Hira is what is today Kufa, which is just southwest of what we know, Baghdad. Baghdad today is up here. Kufa is just down here, very close to it. That the ancient name used to be called Hira in the time period that we're talking about.
I would just another shout out to Joe. Joe has got a presentation on his suggestions for who the people are behind these epithets.
Explain what by epithets. Not everybody knows what that means.
These titles or nicknames that these leaders took upon themselves.
Muhammad is probably one of the most famous epithets because it just means the praised one. Everybody would use that. It's quite a popular title to use as the praised one of God.
Yeah. It seems to be a form of self-aggrandizement, to give yourself a kind of a nickname. It's a bit like, I suppose, Native American Indians gave themselves unusual names as well. Yeah. So that's how I would explain that, Okay, so we have that reference. It seems quite clear. There's a leader who has taken on this title called Muhammad, and he's the leader of a particular group called the Tayyaye. And you can see that he is 12 miles east of Gaza. So obviously this is in contradiction to the standard Islamic narrative that says that Muhammad never entered that neck of the woods, that he died before that time.
Never lived that late and never was that far north.
Yeah. Okay, so then in support of Thomas the Presbyter, there is anonymous reference to a prophet who has appeared with the Saracens. And this is set in July 634. And it says in this passage in the Doctrina Jacobi, he is false, for the prophets do not come armed with a sword. So this protagonist, this individual in the year 634 is clearly someone who believes that they are a prophet of some sort and he's armed with a sword, but the reaction is that prophets do not come armed with a sword. That's the reaction among many of the Jews and Christians at the time. What I'm suggesting here is this is not the Muhammad of the standard Islamic narrative who has got a fictional biography. What I'm suggesting, this is the Muhammad of history. Maybe Jay, you want to talk about that?
Well, yeah. I mean, Mel, if you're looking at the Doctrina Jacobi, you need to be careful. People need to be careful with this because the Doctrina Jacobi refers to this person, this individual who has the Christ yet to come. This cannot be, obviously, this cannot be Muhammad of the standard Islamic narrative because um, he doesn't talk to himself. He never refers to himself as the Christ, not himself, not in the Quran. And in fact, the Quran, the 11 references to the Messiah or the Christ are all referring to Jesus. So that confronts the Quran. Also, in the Doctrina Jacobi, it mentions that he has the keys to paradise. Now, he cannot have the keys to paradise. That comes from Matthew 16, verse 9. So you can see that this person is a Christian, or at least would be unfamiliar with the Bible and would know that this is something that a Christian would claim, not a Muslim. So the Doctrina Jacobi is not talking about a Muslim, not talking about somebody that lives way down south in Mecca and Medina. He's talking about somebody that is actually much further north, that is in Jerusalem, who has a Judeo-Christian monotheistic background, and and also it's interestingly, the whole Doctrina Jacobi is written in Aramaic. Muhammad would never known Aramaic or spoken Aramaic, and the whoever wrote the document did not know Arabic. So, for all those reasons, it cannot be the Muhammad of the standard Islamic narrative, the one from the 9th and 10th century. This is probably the Umar that you're referring to.
Yeah, and you can understand why, because we know all of this, that the standard Islamic narrative needs to move Muhammad before Umar. They need to push him back in time to before 632, because as soon as people know that Muhammad is from this period, it totally blows open the whole narrative, and it brings it down to reality. And they obviously don't want that to happen.
At the wrong place, at the wrong time for the static Islamic narrative. That's why it's so good that we do have these documents from the 7th century and that you're going back to them and you're unpacking them for us.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll just have a look at another very significant reference for us, which is from St. John of Damascus, who is always a favorite of mine in terms of source. He talks about Muhammad. He says, from that time to the present, a false prophet named Muhammad has appeared in their midst. He gave out that a certain book had been sent down to him from heaven. He had set down some ridiculous compositions in this book of his, and he gave it to them as an object of veneration. So what he's suggesting here, and this is, still relatively early, he's saying that this guy is a fraud.
Not 7th century, though. Look at the dates.
Sorry, 8th century. 8th century.
This is not 7th century. This is 8th century. And this would make sense for the 8th century for John of Damascus saying this. What is fascinating, he's talking about this book, but he's referring to a part of the book called the Camel. There is no surah called the Camel in the present day Quran. So he's even talking about a different Quran than the one we have today. Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah. But he's essentially suggesting that this is all a big fraud. He seems to suggest that at this stage, there's all these separate books. They're not one united book, just as you've said. They're all these separate books, and that it's pretty obvious that this guy has written these books or surahs, and he doesn't take it seriously, but that the people have accepted it as a book of veneration or an object of veneration. So this all ties pretty well together.
This book real quickly at this point. This is John of Damascus, First Apologist to the Muslims, written by Dr. Daniel Janasic, who is my colleague. And he goes into this and unpacks exactly what you're saying, Mel. If anybody wants to know about John Damascus and what he said in the 8th century, this is the end of the Umayyad period. He's there in Damascus. He's in the Umayyad courts. He is talking about this Muhammad who is in the 8th century. And he's saying, you've got the wrong man who's saying the wrong thing. And he really confronts the Quran itself. You need to read this book. This goes into it, unpacks it. It's probably the best one I've seen on it by Dr. Daniel J. Janasic, and you can get it on Amazon.
Yeah. The thing is, a lot of people need to appreciate is that John of Damascus is well placed. He and his family were in the administration, in the civil service, essentially, for a key period of this time, and so they're well placed to know what went on. And so when he talks about that, that there's ridiculous compositions written by this guy, we can trust that there's some substance to that. It's not just idle speculation.
And it's because of him that we know that the Quran was still being formed while he was living, while he was there in those courts in Damascus with Abdul Malik and Al-Walid and those who came after. He was part of the Umayyad forming. He was there as it was being formed. And that's why the Quran, he confronts the Quran dramatically. Interestingly, some of the Quran probably does not exist today because of John of Damascus, because he saw so much of it was problem. I would suggest that because of John of Damascus, much of the Quran, like the Surah of the Camel, has been thrown out and not included in the Quran that we have today.
Yeah. Now, as we'll see later, the Quran has had lots of different names down through that time frame. I would suggest another name for maybe work in progress. That would have been a great title for that book.